January 17, 1945, 34,000 feet above the snow-dusted peaks of Mount Fuji. The air was thin and merciless. Inside the cramped cockpit of his Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, Flight Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto could see his breath crystallizing on the instrument panel, despite his leather gloves and fur-lined flight jacket. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the volcanic cone below in shades of amber and violet. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to admire the sacred mountain, the eternal guardian of the Japanese homeland. Then his radio crackled with a transmission that turned his blood to ice. Teki Kashuki Teishu, Hoko Takyo, Suryo Wamide. Enemy bombers, large formation, direction Tokyo, estimated number unknown. Yamamoto's hands moved automatically to the throttle, his Zero-Sen fighter responding with a guttural roar as he banked hard to the northeast. He had intercepted American bombers before, those massive, silver B-29 Superfortresses that droned across Japanese skies like mechanical gods, dropping fire and thunder upon cities that had never known such devastation. He had seen comrades torn apart by their defensive guns, had watched parachutes blossom from stricken aircraft only to be swallowed by clouds. But he had also seen B-29s fall, their wings crumpling, their fuselages spiraling earthward trailing black smoke. The Americans were powerful, yes, but they were not invincible. What Yamamoto did not know, what no Japanese pilot that day could have anticipated, was that the rules of the sky had changed forever. Escorting those bombers, for the first time over the sacred soil of Japan itself, was a fighter aircraft that would rewrite every assumption the Empire's defenders held about distance, endurance, and the reach of American air power. The North American P-51 Mustang had come to Tokyo. For 3.5 years, the Japanese home islands had existed in a state of paradoxical security. Though the war raged across the Pacific, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, the sacred heart of the empire remained largely untouched by direct assault. The Doolittle raid of April 1942 had been a psychological shock, yes, but also a strategic curiosity. 16 B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier, dropping their payloads in a symbolic gesture before fleeing to crash land in China. Brave, certainly, alarming without question, but not sustainable, not repeatable. The vast Pacific Ocean was Japan's moat, just as it had been for centuries. No land-based fighter in the American arsenal possessed the range to escort heavy bombers from the Mariana Islands, the closest Allied air bases, to Tokyo and back. It was a matter of simple mathematics, of fuel capacity and engine efficiency. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin booms and distinctive profile, could manage roughly 450 miles in combat radius. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that brutish, radial-engined beast beloved by European theater pilots, stretched to perhaps 475 miles under optimal conditions. Tokyo lay over 1,500 miles from Saipan. The B-29s could make the journey, but only alone, stripped of fighter protection, vulnerable to the swarms of Japanese interceptors that rose to meet them. American bomber crews called those missions running the gauntlet. They flew at extreme altitude, often above 30,000 feet, where the air was too thin for most Japanese fighters to operate effectively, and they relied on speed, altitude, and their own defensive armament. Still, losses mounted. For every raid on aircraft factories in Nagoya or steel mills in Osaka, bombers fell from the sky, taking with them 10 or 11 young men who would never see home again. Japanese military planners understood this calculus. They had designed their defense in depth around it. Home island fighter squadrons, the 10th Air Division, the 302nd Naval Air Group, trained relentlessly for high-altitude interception. Pilots learned to coax their Ki-44 Shoki and A-6M0 fighters up to the stratospheric realm where the B-29s cruised, where engines stuttered and controls became sluggish, where a pilot's oxygen mask meant the difference between consciousness and a fatal spin into the clouds below. It was brutal, unforgiving work, but it was effective enough. The P-51D, in its final operational form, carried 269 gallons of fuel internally and could be fitted with two 110-gallon drop tanks beneath its wings. With those external tanks, its combat radius extended to an almost incomprehensible 950 miles. Add the Mustang's cruising efficiency, that elegant laminar flow wing designed by North American Aviation's engineers, that Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license by Packard, and suddenly, impossibly, Tokyo was within reach. In November 1944, the first P-51s arrived on Iwo Jima, that sulfurous, contested speck of volcanic rock halfway between Saipan and the Japanese homeland. By January 1945, VII Fighter Command had assembled enough Mustangs to attempt what had been unthinkable just months before, a fighter escort mission all the way to Tokyo. The code name was Operation Jamboree. The objective was threefold: protect the bombers, establish air superiority over the target, and send a message that no corner of the empire was beyond American reach. Japanese intelligence had detected the presence of American fighters on Iwo Jima, but intelligence reports are one thing. Seeing them materialize in your own sky, over your own capital, is quite another. Yamamoto spotted them at 13:47 hours. At first, he thought his eyes were deceiving him. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the glare of the winter sun reflecting off the cloud layer below. But as he closed the distance, there was no mistaking the silhouette. Sleek, single engine with that distinctive bubble canopy and the squared-off wingtips. These were not bombers. These were fighters, American fighters, over Tokyo. His mind raced through the impossible arithmetic. Iwo Jima to Tokyo was over 660 miles. These aircraft had flown that distance, would engage in combat, and still needed enough fuel to return home. How? By what sorcery had the Americans conquered distance itself? The formation was vast, over 100 Mustangs arrayed in staggered layers above and around the bomber stream. Yamamoto had never seen so many enemy fighters in a single place. They flew with a casual confidence, their polished aluminum skins glinting in the afternoon light, their exhaust trails sketching white lines across the winter sky. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. He keyed his radio, trying to keep his voice steady. Kakara Yamamoto, Tekisen Toki Teishu, P-51 to Maidomru, Kurikishi, P-51 da. P-51s. The Americans had brought P-51s to Tokyo. The response from ground control was silence, then a burst of static, then a voice edged with something Yamamoto had never heard from a Japanese officer. Uncertainty. Kakunin Shimashita, Subit no Kaido Budai Koshiki Kaishi. Confirmed. All air units commence attack. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration of industrial and logistical supremacy masquerading as aerial combat. The Japanese interceptors, Tojos, Tonys, Zeeks, and the occasional twin-engine Nick, rose to meet the Americans with the ferocity born of desperation. These pilots were defending their homeland, their families, their emperor. Many were veterans, survivors of campaigns stretching back to China in 1937. They knew every trick, every maneuver. They had nothing left to lose. But the Mustangs had everything to give. The P-51D possessed a top speed of 437 miles per hour at altitude, a full 50 miles per hour faster than the best Japanese fighters. It could outdive, outclimb, and outturn nearly anything in the Japanese arsenal. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered a weight of fire that could saw a lightweight Zero in half, and perhaps most demoralizing of all, the American pilots were fresh, well-fed, and sitting in cockpits heated by bleed air from the engine. Japanese pilots, by contrast, often flew in sub-zero temperatures with minimal insulation, their bodies already weakened by months of inadequate rations, their fuel supplies adulterated with potato alcohol to stretch increasingly scarce petroleum reserves. Yamamoto made his run on a trailing Mustang, coming in from above and behind in the classic bounce attack that had served him well over the Marianas. He lined up the gun sight, felt the familiar vibration of his 20 cannon spooling up, and pressed the firing stud. The shells missed. The Mustang didn't so much evade as simply accelerate away, its Packard Merlin engine roaring to life with a power that seemed inexhaustible. Yamamoto pushed his throttle to the gate, felt his Kai 45 shudder with the strain, but the distance between him and his prey only widened. Within seconds, the American fighter was gone, swallowed by the melee of swirling aircraft. Then the Mustang reappeared behind him. Yamamoto never saw the burst that killed him. The .50 caliber rounds punched through his canopy, his instrument panel, his chest. His last conscious thought was not of the Emperor or of duty, but of his younger sister Akiko, who made him sweet red bean cakes every New Year, and who would now never know what became of him. His fighter entered a flat spin and began its long descent toward the city below. The bomber crews witnessed it all from their vantage point, at 28,000 feet. Second Lieutenant Robert Harmon, navigator aboard the B-29 Spirit of Lincoln *, pressed his face against the plexiglass blister and watched the dogfights unfold below and around them with a mixture of awe and relief. In 11 previous missions over Japan, his aircraft had always flown alone except for the other bombers in the formation, and alone in the sense that mattered most, without friends. Every mission had been a solitary run through flak and fighters, trusting only in altitude, speed, and the waist gunners who crouched at their stations, scanning the sky for the glint of enemy wings. Today was different. "Navigator to pilot," Harmon said into the intercom, his voice tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I count at least 20 Mustangs in our immediate vicinity, maybe more. They're absolutely mauling the Jap fighters." Captain William Sullivan, the aircraft commander, allowed himself a grim smile. "About damn time," he muttered. "About damn time we had somebody watching our backs." The psychological impact of the escort fighters was incalculable. Bomber crews who had grown accustomed to the gnawing anxiety of unprotected deep penetration raids suddenly found themselves shepherded by a guardian force that seemed omnipresent. Every time a Japanese fighter attempted to position for an attack run, a Mustang would materialize as if from nowhere, its machine guns chattering, forcing the interceptor to break off or die. The B-29s pressed on toward their target, the Nakajima aircraft engine plant at Musashino, largely unmolested. For the Japanese pilots still aloft, the realization was setting in. They were not just outnumbered. They were obsolete. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces with over 60 confirmed kills, engaged a Mustang over the western suburbs of Tokyo that afternoon. Sakai was a veteran of unimaginable experience. He had flown over China, the Philippines, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima. He had survived wounds that would have killed lesser men, including a horrific head injury that left him partially blind in one eye. He knew the limits of his aircraft and his own body with the precision of a surgeon. And yet, as he maneuvered his A6M50 into firing position, Sakai understood with crystalline clarity that he was fighting an aircraft that represented a different philosophy of war entirely. The Zero had been designed for agility and range at the expense of armor and firepower. It was a samurai sword, elegant, deadly in skilled hands but fragile. The Mustang was a claymore, heavy, brutal, and nearly impossible to stop once committed to the attack. Sakai managed to land several 7.7 rounds on the American fighter's fuselage, saw the tracers spark off the metal skin, and watched in disbelief as the Mustang continued flying as though nothing had happened. American aircraft were armored. American pilots sat behind plates of hardened steel. American fuel tanks were self-sealing, leaking for a moment before internal bladders contracted to plug the holes. Japanese aircraft had none of these things. Every hit was potentially catastrophic. Sakai broke off the engagement, not out of cowardice, but out of a pragmatism born of experience. He could not win this fight. None of them could. Survival now meant preserving oneself to fight another day, to husband the dwindling resources of the empire for battles where victory was still conceivable. As he turned his Zero toward the airfield at Yokosuka, Sakai permitted himself a moment of reflection that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The Americans had built a better fighter, not just better, overwhelmingly better, and they had built hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. What did that mean for Japan? The numbers tell a story that words struggle to convey. On that first escort mission to Tokyo, VII Fighter Command committed 108 P-51 Mustangs. Japanese defenders sent up an estimated 120 interceptors from multiple airfields around the capital. The resulting engagement lasted approximately 47 minutes. When it was over, the Americans claimed 34 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with another 12 probables. 11 P-51s failed to return, some lost to combat, others to fuel exhaustion or mechanical failure over the vast Pacific. Not a single B-29 was lost to enemy fighters. By contrast, during an unescorted raid on the same target 4 weeks earlier, the 73rd Bombardment Wing had lost 9 B-29s to fighter attacks, with dozens more damaged. The disparity was not lost on Japanese commanders. General Masakazu Kawabe, commanding officer of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, wrote in his diary that evening, "The appearance of enemy single-engine fighters over the homeland changes the essential character of the air defense problem. We can no longer rely on distance as a shield. The implications are profound and deeply troubling." For the Mustang pilots themselves, the mission was both triumph and revelation. They had proven that escort was possible, that Tokyo was not beyond reach. But they had also experienced something that would come to define the final months of the air war over Japan: the sheer, grinding difficulty of fighting at the edge of operational range. First Lieutenant James Tapp of the 15th Fighter Group nursed his Mustang back toward Iwo Jima with his fuel gauge reading 20 gallons remaining. His engine coughed once, twice, as he descended through 10,000 feet, the volcanic island finally visible through the haze. He made the runway with his propeller windmilling, the Packard Merlin having gulped the last of its fuel 30 seconds earlier. Ground crew would later calculate that Tapp had landed with less than 2 minutes of flying time remaining. "I saw Tokyo," Tapp would write to his wife that night, his hand still trembling slightly as he formed the letters. "I saw the Imperial Palace and Mount Fuji, and the streets where they walk. A year ago they told us it was impossible. Today we made it look easy. But Margaret, I have to tell you, it wasn't easy. It was the furthest thing from easy. We flew for 7 hours. 7 hours in a cockpit the size of a phone booth, breathing oxygen, watching the fuel gauges, knowing that if your engine quit or if you got hit, there was nothing below you but ocean for 600 miles. Some of the guys didn't make it back. Good men, but we did it. We proved it could be done." The symbolic weight of the Mustang over Tokyo transcended its tactical impact. For Japanese civilians, the sight of American fighters in the sky above their capital shattered the carefully maintained myth of invulnerability that state propaganda had cultivated. The empire was not inviolable. The divine winds of the kamikaze were not enough. The spirit warriors of the imperial armed forces could not hold back the material tide. For Japanese pilots, the Mustang became a symbol of American abundance that bordered on the obscene. How could a nation produce such aircraft in such numbers while simultaneously fighting a war across 2 oceans and half the globe? Where did the aluminum come from, the fuel, the trained pilots. Japan's aircraft industry was cannibalizing civilian infrastructure just to keep fighters in the air. Schoolgirls were being mobilized to build wooden training aircraft because metal was too precious. And yet the Americans arrived over Tokyo in formations so large they darkened the sky, each pilot sitting in a cockpit that cost more than a Japanese farmer would earn in a lifetime. The answer, though the Japanese high command could not fully articulate it, lay in the fundamental nature of the American industrial complex. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 74,000 aircraft of all types. North American Aviation's Inglewood, California plant was turning out P-51s at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes by the spring of 1945. The Packard Motor Company, better known for luxury automobiles, had retooled its Detroit factories to produce Merlin engines with a precision that often exceeded the tolerances of the original British specifications. American oil fields in Texas and California pumped high-octane aviation fuel with 130-octane ratings, fuel so energy-dense that Japanese engineers would have considered it experimental. And behind it all was a society that had not known war on its own soil, whose industrial cities had not been bombed, whose population was not starving, whose infrastructure remained intact. The Mustang, in this sense, was not merely a fighter aircraft. It was the physical embodiment of the American productive capacity, sleek, powerful, and present in quantities that defied rational comprehension from the perspective of a resource-starved empire. The missions continued through February, March, and into April. Each time, the Mustangs flew a little more aggressively, penetrated a little deeper, stayed a little longer. By March, escort fighters were ranging across the entire Kanto Plain, strafing airfields, rail yards, even individual vehicles on highways. The Japanese air defense system, already strained to the breaking point, began to collapse under the sustained pressure. Flight Petty Officer Kaneyoshi Muto, a 22-year-old pilot with the 302nd Naval Air Group, scrambled from Atsugi Airfield on March 10 to intercept a bomber raid on Tokyo. He never made it to the target. 3 Mustangs caught his formation of 6 Zeros at 15,000 feet and scattered them like leaves in a typhoon. Muto survived only by diving into a cloud bank and flying at wave-top height back to base, his aircraft riddled with bullet holes, his wingman gone. That night Muto sat in the officer's mess and stared at his untouched bowl of rice and pickled radish. A fellow pilot, Ensign Hayashi, sat down beside. "You saw them today," Hayashi said. It was not a question. Muto nodded. "How many?" "Too many." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Hayashi spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we can win?" It was a dangerous question. Defeatism was grounds for arrest, even execution. But they were alone and they were exhausted, and the truth was heavier than ideology. "I don't know," Muto said finally. "But I know we cannot lose the sky above Tokyo and still call ourselves an empire." By April, they had lost the sky above Tokyo. The final act of the Mustangs' debut over Japan came not in combat, but in a moment of almost surreal absurdity that nonetheless captured the totality of American material supremacy. On April 7, 1945, a flight of 4 P-51s from the 21st Fighter Group was escorting B-29s back from a raid on the Nakajima plant, when one of the bombers radioed that it was experiencing mechanical trouble and needed to ditch in the ocean. The bomber, Calamity Sue Asterisk, put down in the water approximately 400 miles east of Tokyo. The crew scrambled into life rafts, and per standard procedure, the escort fighters circled overhead to mark the position for rescue. What happened next was unprecedented. Rather than simply orbiting and waiting for a submarine or seaplane to arrive, a process that could take hours or even days, the Mustang flight leader, Captain Frederick Becker, made a decision that would have been impossible with any other fighter in the American inventory. He radioed the downed crew that the escorts would remain on station until rescue arrived, then calculated his fuel reserves. The Mustangs circled that position for 2 hours and 43 minutes. They flew lazy figure eights at low altitude, waggling their wings at the men in the rafts, occasionally buzzing low enough that the bomber crew could see the pilots waving. They maintained a constant radio watch, updating search and rescue coordinators with precise coordinates. And when a Navy PBY Catalina finally arrived to retrieve the downed airmen, the Mustangs escorted it back to within sight of Iwo Jima before finally turning for home themselves. Captain Becker landed with 32 gallons of fuel remaining. The B-29 crew, interviewed later by a Stars and Stripes correspondent, were effusive in their praise. "Those fighter boys stayed with us for almost 3 hours," said Technical Sergeant Andrew Hollies, the flight engineer. 3 hours over open ocean, burning fuel they needed to get home, just to make sure we didn't die alone out there. That's not just good flying, that's brotherhood. But there was another layer to the story that Hollies did not articulate, perhaps because he could not fully conceive of it. The fact that Stan spoke to a logistics chain so robust, so comprehensive, that fuel could be treated as expendable in service of morale and unit cohesion. Japanese pilots did not have that luxury. They flew their missions on carefully calculated fuel loads with virtually no margin for error. There were no rescue submarines stationed along their routes. There were no friendly islands studded across the Pacific to serve as emergency landing sites. When a Japanese pilot went down over water, he was, with rare exceptions, already dead. The Mustang pilot's willingness to burn fuel to protect downed comrades was not recklessness. It was confidence. And that confidence stemmed from the knowledge that there was more fuel where that came from, that the supply line stretched unbroken all the way back to refineries in Texas, that the American war machine could afford gestures of compassion because it operated from a position of overwhelming material abundance. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the P-51 Mustang had flown thousands of sorties over the home islands. The Japanese air arms had been ground to dust. Airfields were cratered. Fuel depots were empty. The few remaining fighters were being hidden in caves and schools, hoarded for the final, apocalyptic defense against the anticipated invasion. And then the atomic bombs fell, and the question became moot. In the post-war years, when historians and veterans gathered to assess the air campaign, the consensus was nearly universal. The arrival of the Mustang over Tokyo had been the decisive turning point. Not because it won the war single-handedly. No weapons system ever does. But because it destroyed the last vestiges of strategic hope within the Japanese high command. If the Americans could escort bombers to Tokyo, they could escort them anywhere. No target was safe. No distance was protection. Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and lived to the age of 84, wrote in his memoirs, "When I saw the P-51s over Tokyo, I knew the war was lost. Not because we could not shoot them down, we shot down many, but because they kept coming. Every day more of them, always more. We would destroy 10 and 20 would appear the next day. It was like fighting the ocean. You cannot defeat the ocean." The Mustang had become a symbol not just of air superiority, but of the unstoppable momentum of American industrial and logistical power. There is a museum in Chino, California, where vintage aircraft are meticulously restored to flying condition. Among them is a P-51D Mustang, painted in the colors of the 15th Fighter Group, VII Fighter Command. Its nose bears the name *Tokyo Rose and 23 small rising sun flags, each representing a confirmed kill. On weekends, the museum offers flights to the public. For a fee, you can sit in the cramped rear seat, added post-war for training purposes, and experience what it felt like to fly in the aircraft that changed the Pacific War. The engine starts with a cough and a roar, the four-bladed propeller dissolving into an invisible disk. The exhaust stacks spit blue flame, The entire airframe vibrates with barely contained power. And as the pilot advances the throttle and the Mustang accelerates down the runway, this is the machine that appeared in the sky above Tokyo and shattered the myth of distance. And as the Mustang climbs toward the California sky, the Merlin engine singing its distinctive high-pitched howl, you understand something profound about the nature of conflict. Wars are not won by courage alone, nor by ideology, nor by the willingness to die for a cause. They are won by the side that can sustain logistics across oceans, that can produce complex machinery faster than the enemy can destroy it, that can afford to burn fuel for compassion and still have enough to fight tomorrow. The Mustang over Tokyo was more than a fighter aircraft. It was a message, written in aluminum and high-octane fuel and 50 caliber bullets. No matter how far you run, we can reach you. No matter how deep you dig, we can find you. And we will keep coming wave after wave until you understand that resistance is not just futile, it is irrational. That was the lesson the Japanese airmen learned in the winter and spring of 1945. That was the shock that reverberated through every remaining fighter squadron, every air defense command post, every briefing room in the empire. The Mustangs had come to Tokyo, and nothing would ever be the same. In the end, what strikes the modern reader is not the technology itself, though the P-51's performance was genuinely remarkable, but the totality of the system it represented. Behind every Mustang over Tokyo was a supply chain that spanned continents. There were the bauxite mines in Arkansas and Jamaica that provided aluminum ore, the smelters in Pennsylvania and Tennessee that refined it, the factories in California and Texas where airframe components were stamped and riveted, the Packard plants in Detroit where Merlin engines were assembled with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, the oil refineries in Houston that produced 101 30-octane fuel, the transport ships that carried the aircraft across the Pacific, the construction battalions that carved airfields out of coral and volcanic rock, the logistics officers who ensured that spare parts, ammunition, food, medicine, and mail reached those isolated island bases. And all of it, every ton of aluminum, every gallon of fuel, every trained pilot, was surplus to the massive requirements of the war in Europe, where American forces were simultaneously supporting strategic bombing campaigns against Germany, supplying the British and Soviet war efforts, and preparing for the invasion of France. This was the true shock the Japanese airmen experienced. Not just that the Mustangs had reached Tokyo, but that reaching Tokyo seemed almost effortless to the Americans. There was no frantic redeployment of resources, no desperate gamble. The escort missions were planned with the calm efficiency of a logistics exercise. Casualties were absorbed and replaced. Damaged aircraft were repaired or scrapped and substituted. The operation continued, day after day, with a mechanical inevitability that suggested infinite depth. Japan, by contrast, was cannibalizing warships for the steel to build aircraft. Petroleum reserves were so depleted that training flights had been curtailed to the point of uselessness, producing pilots who went into combat with perhaps 30 hours of flight time versus the 300 or more that American pilots accumulated before seeing action. Even food was scarce. The rice ration for civilians in Tokyo had been cut to barely subsistence levels, and military pilots fared only slightly better. America had industrialized warfare to a degree that made conflict resemble mass production. Japan still clung to the ethos of individual warrior spirit, the idea that superior morale and willingness to sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. The Bushido Code taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor, that to perish in combat was to achieve a form of immortality. But the Mustang pilots over Tokyo were not thinking about immortality. They were thinking about fuel gauges and oxygen supply, and whether the weather would hold for the flight home. They fought with competence rather than fanaticism, with the calm assurance that comes from knowing you have backup, that if your aircraft is damaged, you might still make it to a friendly carrier, that if you bail out, there are submarines and seaplanes tasked specifically with finding you. This, ultimately, was what shocked the Japanese airmen. Not that the Americans could fight, but that they could afford to fight carelessly. They could afford to take risks that would be suicidal for a resource-constrained military. They could afford to fly deep penetration missions with comfortable fuel margins. They could afford to orbit over empty ocean for hours just to comfort downed comrades. They could afford to treat war as a problem to be solved through engineering and logistics, rather than an existential struggle requiring total spiritual commitment. There is a final image that encapsulates the entire story, though it comes from a source that might seem unexpected. In September 1945, after the surrender, but before most occupation forces had arrived, a Japanese photographer named Hiroshi Hamiya traveled through the ruins of Tokyo documenting the aftermath. Among his thousands of images is one that has always struck historians as particularly poignant. It shows a group of children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, playing in the rubble of what had once been a residential neighborhood. They have constructed a makeshift aircraft from scrap metal and wooden planks. The wings are crooked, the fuselage little more than a barrel with a chair mounted on top, the propeller carved crudely from a plank. But the intent is unmistakable. They are playing at being American pilots, and the aircraft they have built, with its straight wings and bubble canopy sketched in charcoal on the barrel's side, is clearly meant to be a Mustang. The photograph is titled simply, "The New Heroes." In that image lies a truth more profound than any tactical analysis or production statistic. The Mustang over Tokyo had not just defeated the Japanese Air Force. It had captured the imagination of the defeated. It had become, in the eyes of even the youngest Japanese citizens, the symbol of what modern air power looked like. Not the graceful but fragile Zero. Not the traditions-bound doctrines of the samurai spirit, but the big, fast, powerful American fighter that could fly anywhere